Thanks for joining us. We're here to talk about more third-party libraries, more vulnerabilities. My name's Jake Kouns. I'm the CISO for Risk-Based Security. I am pleased, it's my privilege to be joined by Kymberlee Price, Senior Director of Bug Corral. Operations for Bug Corral. There we go, close enough. So we have a lot of material. This is actually a sort of a complicated topic. It's not just Heartbleed, right? So we're going to go through a lot of material pretty quickly, and we're going to get rolling. So the security industry basically agrees on nothing. I think we can agree on that. But what everyone hopefully should understand by now is that companies are under immense pressure to deliver more and more projects, right? All IT related, right? So features, functionality, all that. There's these crazy deadlines, and now they want the business wants things better, faster, cheaper, and that's just the bottom line, right? And all three of them. And so what are we forgetting? If you can see that, yeah, we're forgetting security, right? Like we normally do. It's get stuff out fast, get it out there. So we have these development realities, right? And this is sort of a representation of the iron triangle. And this just shows sort of the better, faster, cheaper. And again, you're only supposed to be able to pick two of those because in the middle, it's non-existent, right? You can say you want all of that, but how do you really make that happen? And so what developers are doing is they're actually turning to third-party libraries. That's sort of the turn to that for the rescue, right? And so if you think about it, it makes perfect sense. Why, as a developer or development team, would I sit there and start something from scratch, right? If there's already sort of an image rendering solution, why am I going to develop one from scratch? We'll just use that, right? It'll save time. And then secondly, what the heck do we actually even know about this? So one could expect that you're going to get a pretty high quality product, right? So it makes perfect sense. So what's the problem, right? It seems like a great idea. Get it faster, and by now it should be sort of mature and out there. Well, the question is no one knows what the hell's going on. That's one of the biggest problems with it. People are still trying to get their heads wrapped around what exactly is this, right? All right, so let's quickly look at some stats from the OSVDB project about vulnerabilities. Bottom line, this is an eye chart, but code is shit, right? It still is. There's no way around it. From 2002 or 2012 on, we're seeing 10,000 vulnerabilities a year, and there's a big blind spot in this data because it doesn't include software as a service, cloud type stuff, right? So we're not seeing, even though we keep talking about better code, we're not seeing it, right? It's still crap. If you look at a little bit of the data sliced just a bit differently, what you see is things like cross-site scripting, SQL injection. They're like still one of the number 1, 2 most prevalent types of vulnerabilities that we're tracking, and that's 101 stuff that we would have expected to be eradicated years ago, right? All right, so code's not improving, but we know there's a ton of it. So where are the vulns then? Well, there's a company called Secunia out there that did a report in 2014, and they said third-party programs are responsible for 76% of the vulnerabilities discovered in 50 most popular programs in 20. I don't even know what the hell that means, but most people started saying, this is about third-party libraries. When you actually look at the report, what you end up finding that it's pretty flawed, to be quite frank, and you can go read about statistics and vuln statistics and how people abuse those left and right. But this was actually talking about third-party programs, i.e. non-Microsoft things on Microsoft platforms. So that didn't really help as much. So now what? Heartbleed comes out, right? Everyone's freaking out about Heartbleed. All of a sudden, the third-party library stuff is getting the attention that it's sort of expected, right? And so for the first time, most people hear about this thing called OpenSSL. But since Heartbleed, other than maybe this poodle thing, right, there's been no OpenSSL vulnerabilities, right? Nothing, because it hasn't made all these, news outlets and even maybe your mom or dad asking you about this Heartbleed thing. It's sort of freaky when that happens. But if we look at some OpenSSL data, right, all the way down there where that arrow dropped off the screen, that's Heartbleed, right? And then there are all these other problems. In fact, 30 new vulnerabilities. If you love or hate CVSS, doesn't really matter, but 10 max score for a CVSS, average was a 6.35. Remember, Heartbleed was a 5.0, right? If you hate CVSS, that's fine. Let's get rid of it. Now we're talking about 15 of these had some sort of exploit or a proof of concept out, right? So Heartbleed, why was it such a big deal? Mostly, I feel it was because everyone's been told that the internet's a very, very scary place, but if you're surfing the web and you see this beautiful icon, life is good, you're safe. And now we said, oops, just kidding, Heartbleed's out, you're screwed, you may still see the lock, but you're in trouble, right? So that was a fair amount of it. But the next bit was just how widespread it was. And these numbers can be argued, but we know it was well over 100 vendors, well over 600,000 servers were impacted with Heartbleed, tons of different vendors, not just startup and open source type, companies that have no money. We're talking about major vendors using this open, freely available piece of software, right? And so what it introduced to people was understanding that there is this thing called systemic risk in our world, right? Things are interconnected. And so in the insurance world, everyone's aware of catastrophic sort of risk where a hurricane will come in and you have lots of issues. One event leads to lots of claims and issues. Well, now people start to realize that one vulnerability can have this same sort of catastrophic systemic problem, right? So again, what it comes down to is its efficiency, but at what cost, right? It's not just one library impacting many organizations like we talked about. A single application can have hundreds, believe it or not, third-party libraries that make it up. And so that's a whole lot of patching, a whole lot of trying to understand what's going on and keep on top of this stuff. Just how many libraries are out there. We reached out to this company called Black Duck. They have this thing called OpenHub. If you haven't heard of it, go take a look at it. You can find some information. They're saying they track over 1 million open source projects across 6,000 sites. They say 30% of the Forbes Global 2000 is open source code. We think it may be 1,000 or 2,000 libraries, but they keep coming out of the woodworks, right? And then you can see some more stuff on here like sort of how active it is, how much code, here's FFmpeg, and all those sorts of things. So it's pretty neat to see.
Alrighty, so we're going to talk about vulnerability data, and we're going to look at 7 years worth of CVE data. We're going to look at average CVSS scores. Love it or hate it, it's a standard we can use to compare across libraries. We're going to look at the volume of vulnerabilities in those 7 years, and volume is important in conjunction with the CVSS score, as we'll see. We're also going to look at sort of average patches per year, because if somebody has 5 vulnerabilities and 5 patches, that's 5 times your dev team has to touch that, versus if they just have 1 update for those 5 vulnerabilities. So I can follow up with anybody who's interested afterwards. I have this all on a nice little timeline. It can show you year-over-year change, but for today, because we have limited time, we're going to just table it out here. OpenSSL, where we started with Heartbleed, 71 vulnerabilities in 7 years, averaging about 10 per year, average CVSS of 5.49. They release roughly quarterly. FreeType, this is a font rendering library. It's used by a lot of stuff. We'll talk about that in a minute. They had 52 vulnerabilities, averaging 8 per year. However, the average is a little misleading. In 2012, they had 22 vulnerabilities. Most of them were remotely exploitable. So their average CVSS hits 8.02. libpng, I love that a graphics library has the most boring logo ever, but they had 28 vulnerabilities over 7 years. Average CVSS score is only 6.65. Apache Tomcat, this is where it starts to get important to look at both the CVSS score and the vulnerability count. They have 97 vulnerabilities, but their CVSS score is below 5. And the reason for that, when you dig into the data, is they issue a CVE on everything they patch, even if it's a CVSS 2.4. Most vendors would just silently patch that, throw it in, never document it, but they're documenting everything. So if you're making business decisions on what libraries do we use based on the volume of vulnerabilities alone, it's an incomplete picture and you do need to look deeper. Tomcat does have some CVSS 10s, so it's not all like sunshine and roses, but take a look further if you're using that library. Flash Player, now we're seeing some real numbers for vulnerabilities. And there's a few reasons for that. It's not necessarily that it's any less secure than these other libraries, so they have more security testing focus on it. Whether it's their internal testers, if it's their relationships with the security community, if it's Project Zero, there's a lot of people looking at Flash Player. And so you see 55 vulnerabilities per year, 9 releases on average per year, relatively high CVSS score. And the last one is Java, and this one is not 7 years worth of data simply because the data only starts in 2010. However, they've got 481 vulnerabilities in that time, so let's give it up for Java. Nicely done. They're averaging 120 vulnerabilities per year. They release quarterly. They have a very mature release cycle. They occasionally come out with an out-of-bound release when something super important happens, and their CVSS score is 7.36. So, vulnerability spread really quickly on FreeType. It is in lots of devices because GhostScript, that's in printers. Android, iOS, FreeBSD, Chrome, you name it, it's in a ton of stuff. And this is just what's documented on their website. We went out and did additional research. It's also in WebKit, OS X, BlackBerry products, PlayStation. It's in Wii. So, make sure you're updating your Wii, because one of the interesting vulnerabilities in the FreeType library that came out in 2011 was a CVSS 9.3, and it was used in Jailbreak Me for the iOS. So here you have a vulnerability that's being used to jailbreak, and if it were only locally exploitable to the user, it would be a EULA issue, and you probably wouldn't have to worry about it that much, and you could patch it when you get around to it. But it was remotely exploitable. There was a missing parameter that allowed the stack pointer to be moved out of bounds. So now you have remote code execution in the wild on a mobile platform. If you're any of these other users of FreeType, you need to be paying attention to that. libpng, really quickly, hey, we're seeing Microsoft products in there. Because you want to be able to render images. It's all about usability. And this is where we come back to a lot of the things we've heard throughout the conference. Why is it so hard? People want to be able to use their stuff. And so you've got all these people using the libpng library, and are they upstreaming fixes? Are they doing security testing on it? Or are they just consuming it? We're going to talk a little bit more about that. Oh, and it's also used in a bunch of other stuff too. So every time there's a libpng patch, all of these people need to be worrying about fixing that. There is a caveat about the data, and free data is free, which means it's a best effort to get that data correct and validated. If you're paying for data, you can have a little bit higher quality standard. So if you look at CVE details for FFmpeg, you'll see 168 vulnerabilities over those 7 years. And if you look at VulnDB, you will have over 900. And I know, Dan said, if you know math, you only know math. Math is hard, but the reason for the discrepancy isn't that Jake can't count. It's that they're going through FFmpeg and looking for the silent patches, because even FFmpeg will admit that they patch stuff without documenting it. So.
All right, so it's a little bit of a doom and gloom picture, but what's being currently done about this stuff? So all sort of efforts right now are about trying to figure out accountability for this, right? So many developers just, again, think that they're just going to use these libraries and everything's fine and they can trust it. So talking about this, though, there's a couple things when it comes to code quality, and a lot of people will sit there and pound the pavement saying open source is more secure because everyone can review it and more eyes makes all bugs shallow. And that sounds so amazing. It feels great to see that. And the reality is everyone could do that, but we were just talking about vulns that have been sitting in the public eye for 20 plus years, right? So people are not looking at this stuff. So then when you hear that, then people say, well, clearly that means that closed source is more secure because no one can review it and it's supported by enterprises. And I think everyone in this room could say, look, bad code is bad code, right? And we've seen this in closed source as well. Now, money, that's what we need, right? We're learning more and more, and it's just not stopping, that many of these things that we rely on are one person or just not funded well at all. And so we're starting to see things like bug bounty programs to bring attention, code audit initiatives like TrueCrypt and OpenSSL to help things out. So it's show me the money is what we think, right? And so what are some of the results so far? Well, saw a bug bounty program come out, so let's raise money that Heartbleed doesn't happen again. Let's try to raise 100K. Got up to like 7K and it stopped, right? But then we start to see corporations coming in and saying, let's try to avoid this. And so we start seeing some tech giants coming in, and then ultimately this core infrastructure initiative providing some resources. So we're now starting to see some focus and some money going into these things we rely on. Got the Internet Bug Bounty Program's another big one out there, trying, again, things that we rely on, trying to get researchers to spend time on these sorts of things for us, so that's good. Just before we come here, we hear about GNU Privacy Guard, 1997, one guy, he's going broke. Everyone uses it, but he's got nothing, right? And so after this article comes out, now he's got a fair amount of money, right? We see the Linux Core Foundation come again, some other big folks in there. So if you're running sort of an open source thing, try to find a reporter around here, get a message out. You might get some money to help your program. Seems to be working here recently. Google and Project Zero, the dream team of researchers looking for stuff. And again, we're seeing some interesting results out of there. So far, we did some analysis, about 133 vulns have come out. Some interesting things though. Obviously, there's been some argument about disclosure timeframes that everyone's heard. The 0 day, or the also known as the 90 day that they've been dropping on some people. So again, some stats that we saw here, who they were focusing on. You can see the number of vulnerabilities per vendor, just under 60 days average time. What's interesting is there were 3 Microsoft, again, air quotes, O-days that were dropped. And I think you saw the media press about the problems there. But there were also 16 Apple O-days, and here recently 3 Adobe O-days that were dropped as well. But we've seen them starting to move on some time frames. 22 free type, we'll see that. Also been talking about forking for quality, basically saying, hey, we can only secure it if we own it. And so you've seen things like, hey, OpenSSL is problematic. We're going to do this LibreSSL. That's going to be the best. But as soon as it comes out, we hear that it's problematic, catastrophic failure, unsafe for Linux. And then a little bit afterwards, patches out, it's safe. Think as a consumer, what are you supposed to expect? One day you hear it's awful, the next day you hear it's great. And then something that's up and coming was introduced in December, this whole sort of cyber, and you're supposed to yell war, Chris, by the way, Supply Chain Management Transparency Act, basically saying that if you're going to sell anything to the government, it needs a full bill of materials of all the open source components and no known vulnerabilities. So starting to see more and more things coming up.
Alrighty, so we're going to pivot actions and response instead of suggestions for what you could do into a case study of what one company actually did after seeing us first present this last year. But first, a quick view of the incident response process. If you're a product vendor, you identify the issue, you assess impact. Everybody, kind of can walk through you release it with your CVE and post-release. But if the vulnerability was in a third-party library, you get ODA'd when the third-party library releases their advisory. And now you've got to scramble to get that fixed because your IT customers can't patch till you release. They're just kind of hanging out there waiting for the vulnerability to get fixed. So VMware is a company that saw us present last year, and they have a strong security team in a really rapidly growing company. They asked for copies of our slides. They shared their internal security response team data along with our broader analysis with their leadership team, and they got some traction on some really important stuff. Because they already had a mature incident response team, they were already monitoring all the third-party libraries that they used. What they've gone and done is added some proactive evaluation of third-party libraries. Now, they realize they're not going to fix history overnight, but they're making sure that moving forward, the developers are using more secure or vetted libraries that the security team has looked at. They also evaluated a few different products to scan their source code and tell them what libraries do we have where. As Steve Adegbate mentioned yesterday, how are you gonna patch quickly if you don't necessarily know everywhere you have a library implemented? Well, they decided, you know what, we're not gonna rely on developers to just self-report what they use where. We're gonna buy a tool that's gonna do it for us, and we're gonna have that accountability. So they went ahead and did some evaluation and picked up a tool to do that. They hold an internal security conference called MooseCon, and they had us come and speak and give a session to their developers on third-party vulnerabilities, this talk here. And they've expanded their pen test scope to be sure it includes third-party libraries in their products. They're making sure that the scoping docs aren't written to only include native code. They're also partnering with dev teams on the proactive evaluation. Here are the libraries you can use, no questions asked. Here are the libraries you need to talk with us about using. Let's have a conversation about your implementation and your patch strategy. And here are the libraries you can't use. We just won't sign off on them. And they got the approval to do this at the high levels of VMware based on trying to get out in front of the problem and not play whack-a-mole. So, we have time for questions, and we have a minute left. Very excited.
Fantastic. Are there any questions?
People still awake?
Yeah.
It's the post-lunch coma.
All right.
Yeah, I find this a very interesting topic, so thank you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.